And welcome back, everyone. We are talking food today from several different angles. And my next guest is Dr. Joseph J. Luciani. He's the author of Self-Coaching and the Power of Self-Coaching. And he's a practicing clinical psychologist. He's an in-demand speaker and expert on these issues. He's been on many, many media outlets, including MSNBC, CNBC, Discovery Channel, NPR, etc. The list is long. And he's written a new book called Thin from Within, the powerful self-coaching program for permanent weight loss. And this book blends insights from psychology, neurobiology, and the study of motivation. So I would like to welcome the author of this, psychologist Dr. Joseph Luciani, and the book is called Thin from Within. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And you go by Dr. Joe, so we'll be calling you Dr. Joe for the purposes of our show today.
I've been called worse. That's great.
And I want to begin, Dr. Joe, if we can, by beginning with the two reasons that you wrote the book. You said the first had to do with curiosity, and the second was because you wanted to share what you've learned about your emotional struggle with food. So let's begin with the first one, if we can.
Well, the first curiosity, it occurred to me that we tend to be so disciplined in so many other ways in our life other than food. I've seen people run marathons with big, huge bellies. I've seen people that were able to just go to the gym every day and just when it comes to food, just be brought to their knees. So I was curious as to why food and eating, even when it goes against our best intentions, why is it that that's the discipline that we seem to struggle most with? And so I wanted to delve into this both with my patients and out of curiosity. I wanted to understand more about self-discipline, or as we might say, the lack of self-discipline that seems to prevail when it comes to dieting and weight loss. The second reason had to do, I was never really overweight per se, but I did develop a slight heart blockage. And I was given the option of invasive stents or change my diet radically. I chose the latter, and I went to a very strict, rigorous vegan diet. And also in the process gave up most wheat products because of triglycerides. So I went through a very tumultuous period where food became the enemy. Going to a restaurant was just something that was rather depressing. And I had to deal with those cravings and those old habits that were really hounding me. But I was curious about that as well. I wanted to know, well, what does this tell me about both food, my relationship with food, my dependency on food, and what can I do about it? And that was the genesis of really thinking about taking, because typically I've been writing about anxiety, depression, relationship, and I wanted to move now to an area now which really I felt I had some very first-hand experience with, and that was with food, weight loss, and what I call weight mastery.
Right, and a lot of people eat emotionally because they are anxious and they are depressed, all of those things that you focused on before. You have done extremely well putting together a series of programs on self-coaching. What is it about self-coaching that motivates you to do this kind of work?
Well, what initially started me was just the realization that therapy itself was maybe 50% of why people tend to feel better about themselves and their problems. And the other 50% had a lot to do with motivation. And as a therapist, just sitting back and just reflecting wasn't enough. So I wanted to combine a kind of spirited exchange where one could really be motivated and coached to fight the good fight. Because with life, it's often not about learning. It's really putting that learning into action. And to motivate and get someone to really decide to do what's necessary to change habits, that requires a different mindset. And people are reluctant to change. I mean, let's face it, change always has some resistance and some anxiety connected to it. So I felt that I needed to come up with something that would, just like a coach on the sideline of a ball game, to really get somebody in that fight, to get them out there to really overcome the hesitations that keep them from the life they want.
Right.
So that was the genesis of the self-coaching model, which has followed me through all my books. And with eating, it certainly is a fundamentally important, because the key to permanent weight loss is, of course, the motivation. With any diet, with any attempt to lose weight, if we lose the motivation, then we've pretty much lost the battle.
Right. So why, I mean, you devote a whole chapter to this, so I know this isn't, you can only give us a quick answer here, but why is it so hard to say no? Is it purely just habit?
Well, we are creatures of habit, and there are a few reasons why it's so hard to say no. It's what I call habit resistance. We tend to, from our earliest days with food, we tend to develop a kind of peculiar relationship with food. We no longer use food to fuel our bodies. I mean, back in Stone Age days when Fred and Wilma Flintstone were foraging around, a few berries or some roots and tubers would be enough to satisfy them and set off the appropriate amount of pleasure chemicals in the brain. But, nowadays with the scientifically engineered hyper-palatable foods, we don't stand a chance. Our brains are flooded with the feel-good chemicals that really make us want to go back again and again for that toxic food. So it's very important to understand that with food, we are up against the chemical aspect or the addictive compulsive aspect of food, as well as our general nature to resist change. We were all born to avoid pain and seek pleasure, and we have come to use food as our vehicle for pleasuring our minds, not our bodies. And that's the key. We're not feeding our bodies anymore. We're feeding our minds.
Right. Well, there's a great quote in the book by Miss Piggy, "Never eat more than you can lift." I just love that quote. But you just mentioned it begins in the mind. So let's look at that because there's biology going on there, and it plays into it quite a little bit. So you say, you call it mind tasting. You say it's not just mental. Talk to us about mind tasting, if you would.
I would say that mind tasting is probably the most significant part of my book. When you see a picture, when you are walking in a mall and you smell the aroma of Cinnabon, did you just smell it when I mentioned it?
Yes, I pictured it too, with extra topping.
What happens is that this isn't a passive process. Our bodies are actually changing according to the mental image that we are receiving in our brains. And when that happens, things start to happen in our body. Saliva increases, gastric acid, insulin, blood sugar, fatty acids. All these things are a result of mind tasting. Now, mind tasting, if left unchecked, will lead just one direction, and that's right to the pantry. So mind tasting is very, very critical in this whole battle of weight loss and really weight mastery, because once you see, we have a certain consciousness that we bring to our attempts to lose weight, and that comes from our intention to diet. And whatever your diet is, this book is not about a diet. It's not a diet book. It's to be used with any diet of your choice. So you bring your good intentions forward and you say, I am only going to stick with this plan. Well, that's great, but you have to realize that when you're passing by that Cinnabon stand or a piece of chocolate cake or a brownie, what happens is that just below the surface comes these thoughts that now fill our brain with the mind tasting. And the door gets cracked open, ajar a bit, and what comes through that door are the impulses that create the physiological changes that now create a compulsive, yearning longing. Once that happens, then those intentions that we first started out with get somewhat submerged. And then if we linger, and here's the key, if we linger with mind tasting, not only do those intentions get submerged, but they really get defeated, and we lose that battle.
Right.
So one of the really big keys is when you start to realize you're tasting that food, that the sooner you nip that in the bud, the better your chances of pulling away.
Right. I've noticed, if I sit down to watch television, it's usually fairly late at night, and Top Chef is a show that I like to watch, and I've noticed that drives me to the kitchen. So I've stopped doing that now. I watch it on demand earlier in the day.
Well, if I may interrupt, it's such a very important concept that we miss quite often. We often say things like, it made me want to eat, or she made me go to the pantry. She got me so upset. Things, people, places, they don't make us eat. We make us eat.
Right.
And so and I know you didn't mean this, but basically it's really about taking responsibility for our eating and our lives.
Right. Well, I take my, dog goes everywhere with me. We go to the bank through the drive-through. He knows they feed him cookies. And they say, oh, your dog's so patient sitting there. But when I look around, there's drool about 6 inches long hanging from his mouth waiting for that cookie. So he's conditioned. It's conditioning.
Well, we tend to drool as well in different ways. We tend to savor, that's going back to the mind tasting. We start to savor these thoughts, and in a sense, we're promoting that saliva and drooling, just like pooch.
Right. You talk about creating an enemy checklist, and you talk about the tipping point. Why it's important for us to recognize what leads us to our tipping point. So I wonder if you'd talk a little about that.
In the field of epidemiology, the tipping point is a point where a virus or a disease cannot be controlled. When it comes to eating, it's the point where you either capitulate or walk away from the tempting food. But what's important is what leads up to that tipping point, and that's the period of ambivalence. This is where mind tasting is going on. This is where the devil is on one shoulder and the angel on the other, and should I, and shouldn't I. And this battle is so significant and it's so important. What people need to understand is that, just because you're being sabotaged by these feelings, it ain't over until it's over. Until the point where that fork reaches your mouth, you are still capable of walking away. So we're really talking about, getting knee deep in our typical compulsions and urges, but getting out of the muck and mire, even though you're knee deep in it. So it's really recognizing that you always have a chance to incorporate various strategies, to fight the good fight, to really resist. And until that fork reaches your mouth, you should not be handing yourself over that easily. Mm-hmm. And, so it's important how we fortify ourselves, how we start to develop that, I call it a self-discipline muscle, because it's really important to recognize that if you've struggled with weight, and there was a study done in England where by the age of 45, the average woman has been on 61 diets.
Oh my gosh.
So it's just incredible that we tend to just go down that yo-yo highway again and again and again. And we're not learning anything because, we tend to put all our stock in the diet and we say, well, this diet's going to be the miracle thing that I've been looking for. But sure, you may lose a few pounds, but 80% of people who lose the weight put it back right on within 2 years. Mm-hmm. So we may be temporarily losing weight, but we're not changing us. And unless you change your mindset, your habits, unless you change you're going to be one of those 80%ers.
So what might be a self-coaching tip when we're in that state and we're starting to go down that rabbit hole where we're going to reach that tipping point of putting the food into our mouth? What might be a self-coaching tip for us to stop that happening?
Well, the first thing is I have a technique in the book. I call it self-talk. And the first step in self-talk is to separate facts from fiction. So you really need to stay conscious. You see, because the urges and compulsions are always trying to drag us. I love your rabbit hole image. They're trying to drag us into that rabbit hole. And so being conscious, we've heard the term now being used quite a bit, mindfulness. Being mindful and conscious of our intentions is very important because once we allow ourselves to become somewhat clouded from those intentions, we're in danger. So separating fact from fiction is to not be dragged into rationalization. I'll just start my diet tomorrow, or I'll start exercising in a week. Not to be dragged into self-deception or even faulty feelings. Because people say, I feel so hungry. Feelings aren't facts. It's very important that we recognize so many ways that we tend to deceive ourselves. I call it mind games. And we play these mind games all the time. It's like It's like going to a supermarket and just saying, well, I'm just going for a loaf of bread. And that's not what you come out with. You know, you really let yourself, or standing in front of the fridge and saying, now what do I feel like eating tonight? That's a real dead end right there.
Right. Yes, I know the feeling myself, run in for a carton of milk and come out with all kinds of stuff I didn't need or want. My guest has written a book called Thin from Within, the powerful self-coaching program for permanent weight loss. And my guest is Dr. Joseph J. Luciani. He's a psychologist. And I asked you before the break if we could talk about the three big enemies, as you call them, Dr. Joe, adverse circumstances, harmful emotions, and destructive habits. So let's look at our enemy checklist there so we know what we're dealing with.
Okay, well, when I talk about the enemy checklist, it's very important to when you sit down to eat, or when when that thought goes through our mind, I'm hungry, we have to challenge that. Let's find out what's driving the hunger, because physiological hunger is very different from psychological hunger. With psychological hunger, we're feeding the mind, or we're anesthetizing ourselves from the stress and duress of life. So it's very important to know your enemies. As Sun Tzu said, to know your enemies, and when it comes to food, it's certainly applicable. So let's start with the stressful circumstances. A bad day at work, an argument with a neighbor, difficulty with the kids. Stress is not an innocuous, of course, emotion. And stress is something that we want to try to quell as quickly as possible. So food, of course, comes to mind when we're stressed, because it does tend to sedate us. It does tend to release dopamine, which is the pleasure chemical in the brain, and we tend to feel better. So stressful circumstances will certainly conspire to almost knee-jerk, reflexively get you thinking about, well, what will make me feel better? And certainly food comes to mind. That goes also for harmful emotions. Same kind of emotions can create stress, depression, anxiety, boredom. People don't realize that boredom is an emotion. Mm-hmm. And when we are bored, stressed, anxious, depressed, we are also wanting to do something to sedate ourselves, to anesthetize ourselves. And again, food becomes the go-to vehicle for just excusing us from the duress of our lives. These enemies are very important to understand, because when you're in the cloud of a compulsion or an urge, or just destructive eating in general, when you realize what's driving it, you stand a much better chance of keeping those intentions foremost and keeping those intentions conscious. And the third, of course, is habit. As we've mentioned earlier, we are creatures of habit, and so many habits, when just talking about emotions, when we're depressed, we tend to eat. We sit in front of a TV and we put our plate in front of us. We reach into a bag of chips, and before we know it, the bag is empty. We are creatures of habit, and habits, by their very nature, can exist just below the level of consciousness. So when you are not aware of your habits, or any of the enemies for that premise, of course, then you are most susceptible to eating destructively and feeding the mind, not the body.
Right. It really is all about paying much more attention to what we're doing, isn't it? And just not going on that train trip.
But that's exactly it, because basically what happens when we get hypnotized and seduced by the feelings of wanting certain foods, what happens is that those feelings are very powerful, and they will cloud and fog the desire or intentions to lose weight or to eat appropriately. So we're up against some powerful biological, psychological influences that really are, if we do nothing, and if we don't insist on an active, not a passive, but an active mindset, then you are going to fall prey. Now, this is during the transitional period when you're losing weight and when you're going to weight mastery. In time, we actually retrain the brain. And this is not a fictional thing. We actually change the structure of our brain. So eventually what happens and we call this neuroplasticity, we're actually changing our habits. I call it habit reformation. At this point, we're no longer struggling. It's my own struggle I've had with changing my diet to this very strict vegan diet of mine, that in time it becomes effortless. And I know people don't realize that because typically we don't go the distance by just dieting. But if you change your lifestyle and you learn to really do the things that are necessary to maintain the restructuring of your habits, then it really isn't a matter of struggle. And, that's a wonderful thing when all of a sudden you can sit and see somebody eating a piece of Dutch, I don't know, what's your favorite dessert? Mine might be dark chocolate cake or something. And to just really say, it would taste good, but you know what, I don't need it. Without any emotional regret, without any feelings of victimization. That's the place you get to when you can really retrain your brain to see food differently and to experience it differently.
Right. And that's why I think this book is so great, because you look at the psychological aspects and you look at the biological aspects. And I think, at least for me, if I understand what's going on physically in my body and, why this chemical may be kicking off, it helps me to counteract it. And you talk about dopamine, it's something that is stimulated by most street drugs out there. So it's a pretty powerful weapon, isn't it, really?
Yeah, people don't realize that it is the same pleasure center of cocaine, of heroin. I mean, food is powerful. And food, when we think about it, food are chemicals, and they break down in our body the same way that other chemicals do. So, yes, we are up against a flooding of various chemicals that really resist change. And I would say that it's all about responsibility, I call it mind over mouth. And if we don't take responsibility, then we're eating like children, impulsively. That's how children eat. A 6-year-old child isn't going to weigh the pros and cons. They just want that ice cream cone.
Right.
So when we eat like children, then, of course, this is the loop that we get ourselves into. We're not realizing the adult, mature perspective, which requires gritting of the teeth a bit, but taking that mature responsibility really is staying consistent with our true intention.
Yes.
And that's really what life should be about. It goes far beyond just food as well.
Yes. Well, you say in the book, the bleak reality is that, while many people can lose weight, more than 80% of people who diet will gain that weight back. We spend more than $30 billion each year on gym memberships, diet books, and diet plans, etc., etc. But so many people, and I've done this myself, have said, they get to a certain point and they're doing well and people start to acknowledge, hey, you're looking great, and you start feeling great, and then they self-sabotage. What's going on there? Why do we do that? How can we stop it?
Think of a rubber band. As we diet and we go through the stress of dieting, the rubber band begins to stress. Now, you're going through some withdrawal. You're eating and staying on your diet, but the rubber band is getting stretched. There comes a point where the rubber band snaps back, and that's where maybe you've had that slip, or maybe you've just lost the intention or motivation. So unless you go the distance, you see, losing most diets will help you lose weight. There's no misunderstanding there. Diets do work, but you see, unless you can go beyond the point where that rubber band snaps back, then you really haven't accomplished fundamentally anything because you haven't changed. So it's so important to realize that it's not really a matter of losing weight, it's the keeping it off. That's really the key. And if you think in terms of what's the next miracle diet, there are over 70,000 diet books on Amazon.
Wow.
They can't all be, just faulty. Everyone has something to say about it, and they all do something. But you know what? The truth is, no diet in the world is going to give you the life you want and the figure you want and the fitness you want unless you decide that it's up to you to really go the distance.
Right. Well, the book is packed full of self-coaching tips, inspirational advice, psychological, neurobiological information. What do you want listeners to take away from this?
Well, again, to me, the fundamental essence of this whole book is the concept I mentioned earlier of mind over mouth. I think that once you realize that there is no alternative to lifelong weight mastery except retraining your mind and your brain, unless you're willing to do that, then accept the fact that you're going to be on that yo-yo highway again and again and again. At least be realistic, at least be honest with yourself. But if you want a life of fitness and if you want to lose that weight forever, then at least recognize that there are going to have to be some fundamental changes, and you're going to have to learn to fight the good fight. Hopefully my book can help motivate someone to realize just how to do that.
Yes, I told you before we came on air, you wrote this book just for me, but I'm sure millions of people are benefiting from it. So thank you very much, Dr. Joe. I appreciate it.
Well, you're quite welcome. Thank you.
And I know listeners can find out more about Dr. Joe and his work at self-coaching.net, self-coaching.net. And my guest, Dr. Joseph J. Luciani, of course, psychologist and self-coaching expert. His book, Thin from Within, the powerful self-coaching program for permanent weight loss.